Most of this is available online as a preprint and also available now published in the American Journal of Epidemiology. It's a long road to get there, but if you have other questions or you're like, I wonder if some of this is discussed in a supplement on the internet, the answer is probably yes. Right, so what's the plan for today? Briefly, I want to talk through our study, Causal and Associational Language in Observational Health Research, our systematic evaluation. Talk a little bit about how that work was done, what we were up to, what we found, what we think it means, why we thought it was worth doing in the first place. And then because, perhaps oddly, in addition to the center that Peter mentioned, also part of the Center for Humanities Engaging Science and Society. I'm a humanities scholar. My background is in philosophy. I do philosophy of science. So because that's my background, I participated in this kind of empirical research, but also I'm unable to resist offering 3 brief philosophical reflections on this work. I think there's some really interesting philosophical stuff going on in this empirical work, and you've got to say something about that. So I'll point to some philosophical literatures that you can look at if you're also interested in this aspect of things. Right. So I think the proper way, the only really way to start off this conversation about this work is to point to this very long list of co-authors. At least one of them is in the room. You see Peter is in there. You know, I am the second author, right? Noah Avery is the first author. We have a huge list of people who are involved in making this project happen. And we'll come back to that as a sort of through line through this work. This was all totally would not have been possible without this large group of folks, some of which I believe are joining online, some of people I've never met in real life. I met a few of them at SER. That was wonderful. So welcome. Hi, co-authors, if you're here as well. So this large list of co-authors were all involved in this project. We also had additional contributions, people who had a look at drafts or talked through the ideas or saw an early version of this presentation, and we thank them as well for their input. Okay, so what's the big idea behind this project? Well, big idea is something like, maybe you've had this thought as well. When someone says X is associated with Y, or coffee is linked to Alzheimer's, or something like this, what do they actually mean there? So there's a kind of underlying practice. It's fairly common. I don't think I'm saying anything too controversial in saying there's a kind of practice of just say association that turns up as sort of a pragmatic advice you might give someone who's looking to participate, looking to publish in the health literature. You can kind of see some of this in force in terms of who can talk about causes and who ought not talk about causes, and things like what we ended up calling the JAMA rule. JAMA has a author's guide publication rule requiring that if you want to talk about causes in your paper, you need to have done an RCT. If you're going to do a randomized control trial, you ought not be talking about causes. I've recently heard they're considering changing this, and that would be wonderful. I'd be very excited to hear that. But while we're doing this work, that was something that was in play. So there's this kind of idea that maybe what's happening is we're using association as sort of a conservative euphemism for what's really happening as causal inference. Or maybe broadly, maybe less controversially, maybe there's just a disconnect between what are the authors intending to do when they do their work? What kind of technical language are they using? Are they using the technical language that's appropriate for the kind of association or cause they want to talk about? Maybe there's something going on there with their methods. Have they chosen the right methods that will allow them to use the sort of words that they'd like to use? Or maybe they're just making broad claims afterwards that are in a way that we might want to censor or want to be concerned about. So there's a literature that we're pointing to here that's noting this sort of disconnect. In addition, there's been this goal. Various people have tried to make these lists of words that we should think of as causal. So various people have this project of like, well, cause is clearly a causal word, but what about these other things like association or link or leads to or raises? How causal should we take those to be? Different folks have attempted to make sort of scales or lists of the words you should think of as causal and lists of the words you should think of as less causal. Not clear how successful that has been. That's a tough thing to nail down. Okay, so let's get a little bit more detailed here. That was all pretty big picture. What are we talking about here? We're talking about when you're looking at a paper and you're trying to decide what's going on in this paper, you might come across something like this. It's pretty common in the health literature. Something like, we found that X may be correlated with Y. This evidence suggests we should reduce consuming X. Okay, so what are the parts of that? Let's kind of break down the components that are happening there. For the rest of what we're trying to talk about here, we're going to say the exposure is X, the outcome is Y. We're going to take that correlated with, we're going to call the phrases like that, and phrases like that the linking phrase. This one also happens to have a modifying phrase, so work is done by that may be to kind of make things more nuanced, maybe give the authors a little wiggle room, so that we're going to call that a modifying phrase. We did some work, I'm not going to get into it in this, talking about how common or non-common those modifying phrases are and what work they do. And then additionally, this little paragraph, we got what we're going to call an action implication, that section that says we should reduce consuming X. Okay, so it didn't just say, oh, we found that X may be correlated with Y. There's also this, like, there's a thing we should do with that. And we're going to call that an action implication for the rest of this topic. So what we have here, we have what kind of causal things are happening here. We have causal linking words or phrases that might imply that X influences Y, or levels in or changes in Y could be attributable to X. We also have some causal stuff happening in an action implication, right? So if we're going to make a claim about how to use the results, often you might think that that kind of claim about how to use the results might require that something has been causally established. Okay, so we're worried that this sort of situation that we find ourselves in, where people are doing this sort of dance about, should I talk about causes in my paper? Should I talk about association? Should I use some kind of other word? It could have a whole bunch of bad consequences. I think I could recommend a philosophy paper about each of these in terms of making the claim that this sort of dance between association and causation and other kinds of words here results in poor communication, double standards for different kinds of disciplines, maybe poor quality methods and evaluation, eventually leads to inappropriate strength of evidence hierarchies. That would be some work to get that done. And it may also devalue non-causal associations, descriptive work, other things we don't necessarily want to devalue, but this kind of pressure towards talking causally, even if maybe you ought not, leads down that road. So we've got some problems. What do we want to do in this study? We want to find out a couple primary objectives. The first one is just basically like, what kind of linking phrases are being used in literature? I've been talking in terms of association and cause. People are usually pretty on board with that, but there's a lot of them. So let's sort of get a scope. Let's identify those association and causal linking words, and let's identify the linking words that are being used in high impact published health literature. And then let's try to generate some kind of estimates of the degree to which these linking words imply causality. That's quite a trick, and we kind of started heading in that direction. So we have two additional primary objectives, which were to examine how often those recommendation and action claims, how often do we get those? And especially given that having those in place might require that causal inference has already been made. And then we also want to examine the prevalence of disconnects between linking words and action claims. So if at the top you said something like coffee is associated with Alzheimer's, and then at the end you say something that suggests that actually what you mean there is quite clearly that coffee causes Alzheimer's in the what we should do about this policy section. So if there is that kind of disconnect, we want to know about it. Some secondary objectives, some other things we're kind of interested in while we're working with this. Is to develop this list of linking words and flag the ones that we think should imply causality. That had been done by other folks. We thought we'd give it a crack at it as well. We could try and document changes between the title, abstract, discussion, and action implication sections. Like some people might have the intuition that discussion sections, people are kind of more freewheeling, maybe they're bolder in their claims there. We'd have to look at that. And we want to identify differences across different types of studies and different kinds of journals. Maybe RCTs are quite different than other kinds of things. Maybe certain kinds of journals are sort of different on this subject. Okay, brief methods talk here. So what did we do? We did a systematic, guided, subjective, large-scale, replicable review. we reviewed more than 1,275 articles from 18 high-profile journals. We looked at a random sample of high-profile health, medicine, epidemiological published research in the last 10 years. We did this in this order. We did a search and a screen for the articles we're going to look at. We did a main independent review of the articles, so each reviewer looked at these articles. We arbitrated those reviews across different reviewers, so the different reviewers could talk to each other and say, like, well, I thought it said coffee causes Alzheimer's. Well, I thought it said that coffee is associated with Alzheimer's. We need to come to some conclusion there. And then we did our root word exercise where we asked the people who had been the reviewers how causal they took some of these linking words to be. We got a Prisma guideline for how we ended up with the articles that we ended up with. I would say to examine that more in detail at your leisure, because we have lots of things to get through. So I think it'd be reasonable for you to have some questions about the inclusion criteria. What kind of things were we interested in when we said, like, this is the kind of literature we want to look at when we were trying to decide how things look in health research. We chose high profile journals. We did that based on impact factor, or being included on our H-index. We chose journals that focused on health, medicine, and epidemiology. There were some edge cases, but we focused really on those. We didn't include all articles. We wanted articles that were about a single exposure and outcome pair. Some did more than that, and that was just too complex to be included in this. We also did not include meta-analyses or reviews. What do we do to get our search and screening in that phase one I talked us through? We did a keyword search in PubMed. We did a screening review in order to be the sort of person who could do the review. There was a 1 hour training. We had a small group of our 10 review people. We had them look at the title and abstract review for meeting inclusion criteria. Like, do we want to include this in our study? Not necessarily tell us what the content is, but like, is this within our inclusion criteria? We did a 2+1 model for screening review. So we had an arbitrator who resolved conflicts. So if somebody said, like, yeah, this one's in, and somebody said, yeah, no, it's out, then we arbitrated between them. We pulled out of the selection stratified by journal. We selected out most RCTs. We wanted a small pool of RCTs to compare, but we didn't include most of those. Our goal here is generally to sort of maximize our use of resources, right? We can't include everything that's been published, but we do want to include a nice broad swath of it. And our goal was to have something like 65 non-RCTs and 6 RCTs from each journal. So then we sort of move on to from the article selection and search and the screening to the independent review section. The idea here is sort of to establish a baseline for our data extraction to sort of understand what we're looking at in this group of articles. And then when it comes to this arbitration work, because you'll notice that I keep talking about that we had two different screeners and someone has to make a call. We don't necessarily want it to be the case that the one or the other needs to convince the arbitrator. The arbitrator can make a different choice than either of the two previous people have made. The idea is that they take what they've learned from the two previous reviewers and use their best judgment. Okay, so now we get to the actual review. We get 2 primary reviewers per article. All of the articles that were included in the project got title and abstract review. A third of those got additional in-depth full text review, so it was additional sections of the articles. So the title and abstract review was sort of more basic of these, looked at the identifying the exposure and the outcome, looking for that main linking sentence, looking for that main linking word or phrase, looking for an action implication, and looking to see like how causal they took that action implication to be. If that article selected for additional review, we did all of that. Plus, we also looked at for additional talk about causes in the discussion and conclusion. We looked for things like causal disclaimers. So if the author said something like, of course, causation is not, of course, correlation is not causation, or if they said like, it's very difficult to get causation from an observational study, or they made some kind of comment of this kind, we noted that. That's something that our reviewers looked for. We looked for some basic methodological information. So like, what did they say about their methods? What do they say about causes in their methods? And then we looked for things like, do they have any models? Did they include DAG? Did they talk about any kind of causal theory that was influencing their choice of methods or their work? So that was the sort of more in-depth. So everybody got the title and abstract, some got the more in-depth version. Okay. So when we say in that linking sentence, we ask them to rate the causal implication strength of that linking sentence. This was the scale we used. You can look at it again at your leisure. But the idea was to give an account of, or say something about how causal they took that linking sentence to be, where they could say none, weak, moderate, or strong. And these are the definitions that we painstakingly, after much debate between 48 people, came to the conclusion we would use. Perhaps some of the most interesting would be like the moderate version. It says the linking sentence mostly implies the causal relationship was identified, but it's unclear or possible to come to the conclusion that in the absence of any causal inference. So, these definitions are hard to apply. It took a lot of judgment, and it was difficult for some of our reviewers to make these work. But I don't think there's really any getting around that in a certain way. We have a similar set of scale for the action recommendation. You can see the way those definitions were modified here. So in our phase 3, the arbitrator takes what we've learned from the 2 reviewers, takes its independent reviews and makes their best judgment based on the independent reviews, their subjective judgment, and the experience from the discussion, which we allowed that they chatted amongst themselves about, like, well, we had one that was an edge case, not the specifics of the article, but like we had one that we thought was an edge case. We decided it was weak because X, Y, and Z, and that discussion was permissible as a reason for the arbitrator to make a call. All right, so we've seen that. So in our last section, we asked folks to have a look at, we pulled all the, what we called the root words from those linking phrases. So your cause, your associate, your higher, your lower, your risk, those kind of words, pulled them out of their context, took those most common words and asked them to give causal implication ratings for the words without any context, which is very difficult. People mostly say, like, no, I need the details. I couldn't possibly say anything about this. But we asked them to give it their best shot. Given all of the talk about with reviewers and all their work, it's important, I think, to say a little bit about who our reviewers were. We had 48 co-author reviewers. They were recruited mostly from social networks, personal and online. Many of them were people we didn't, the top editors did not know, or people we learned about on Twitter. We had a very wide, diverse set of folks who were involved in this. We were somewhat constrained that we did want them to have some expertise in the field. We wanted them to be potential consumers and producers of health research, like the people who were involved in this kind of work. We didn't go out and get mathematicians or something like that. We got folks who were somewhat related to the work. So what were they like? Our 48 co-authors. Here is our 48 reviewers. Here is some information about them. We've got, let's see, some overlapping categories here, but some of them are academic, some were not academic, some of them had clinical training, some were practicing clinicians. We had lots of epi people, but we also have 2 philosophers. Yes, okay, fighting the good fight. 1 dentist, all right, so somebody from social work. We had a lot of folks who were at sort of doctoral PhD level or working on a postdoc, but we have some junior faculty, some senior faculty. We're a little bit US heavy, but we have some folks from other countries as well. And we just wanted there to be input from a variety of different perspectives that remain relevant. There's so many consumers that produce this research, not too left field, but from many different perspectives. Okay, to take one more step back here, I think we need to note that there were lots of strange things about this study. One of the things was just that it is this kind of meta collaboration that was happening online during the pandemic. Most of us never met each other. We used Slack. We talked almost every day on Slack. There was the first author, Noah, had a running commentary on Twitter talking about the process of making all of this happen. It's just a huge scale. There's 1,000 articles for these people to review. There was interesting group dynamics in terms of like somebody's defending a dissertation via Zoom next week and they couldn't possibly finish their review. And all right, so somebody's in another country, and so we're dealing with time zone differences. So the group dynamics are really interesting here. I learned so much about this sort of meta picture stuff as well. We wanted to leave open if somebody else wants to do something like this in a different field or thinks that they could do it better if they did 10 times as many articles. We wanted to leave that open for them. So a lot of the code is available online. All of our like process stuff is available online if you're interested. So that somebody else wants to do this, they absolutely can. It hopefully won't be as hard for them as it was for us. And we are hyper transparent. Not only we're kind of talking about this on Twitter, like for this presentation, the first version of this presentation was, I think it was created using Twitch. So they watched it be made, if that was interesting to you. But most of the work was done in this like very transparent way. If you were interested in this project, you could see all of the nuts and bolts. How the sausage was made was quite available to you. Okay, so what are the results? The most common root linking word in the index was associate, which, you know, maybe you're not shocked by. But after you say like, yes, that's kind of what we expected, have a look at these other linking words. Some of them I think are just fascinating in terms of the way in which the language gets used here. We've got cause, we got a couple causes, we've got lower, we got reduce, we got risk factor, we've got better, right? So there's the ones you expect right there at the top. There's the result that you expect about associate, but there's just this array of ways that we talk about this. Okay. So what else have we got here? How strong, using those subjectively generated causal implication strength results we got from our reviewer, how strong do we take the different components of these articles to be? Well, one of the things that made some of this difficult, in the leading sentence in the abstract, we had no causal implication in about 14%, weak in 34%, moderate in 33%, strong in 18%. In the action recommendation, which we would be interested to see how different or how similar those were, what I was really fascinated by was that we only had action recommendations in 34% of the articles, right? I would have guessed, if you had asked me, like, how do scientists write articles about their work, I would assumed in the discussion, like at some point, they're going to make a claim about what should be done with this information that they've worked so hard to produce. And we only found something like that in 34% of the work. But when we did, roughly 5% was had no sort of causal oomph to it, weak in 19%, moderate in 42%, strong in 33%. Right, so here, what's important about this diagram is you might think that there was a relationship between the strength of the causal implication in the linking phrase. So at the top of the article, you say, we studied coffee and Alzheimer's. Whatever strength there was there, you might think that strength should also be reflected in the action recommendation causal strength, and that would lead to like the middle diagonal like lighting up as that's where you might expect there to be overlap. But instead we get this kind of pattern pulling towards stronger on the action recommendation level. So you might have expected that bright line on the diagonal. That's not quite what we found. So when we come to the linking sentence versus the action recommendation, a little bit more detail about that. Again, emphasizing that we only had these 400 studies that had action recommendations at all. And 44.5% of those had action recommendations that more strongly implied causality than the linking sentence. So there was a little bit of this punch up in the action recommendations. Let's see, other things that might be sort of, you're causally interested, if you're interested in causal inference, you might be interested to know some of these additional items about the body of literature we looked at. We found 10 causal DAGs in this group. So that's where that stands. We had in the discussion mostly no of these. This is from the more detailed, where we got into like looking at the discussion parts rather than just the abstract and title. When we did that more detailed work, we found mostly there was no kind of causal disclaimer statement. We had a couple where they had yes. There was some talk about confounders. There was some occasional causal theory work. There's some talk of controlling or adjusting for variables. Right, so here we have our list of row words on let's see, my left, your left. You've got them in order of rank, right? So these are all those words and how causal we took them to be. And then on the right, we have them sorted alphabetically. So you're the favorite linking word, you can see how causal we took them to be. These are just sort of interesting to compare, like if you personally think that like demonstrate is clearly more causal than link, you can have a look and see how this compared to our reviewers' instincts on that. Okay, so what are sort of the results of the summary of the results generally? The most common linking word is associate. Maybe that's what you would have guessed, but there were some surprising findings as well. Most studies used language that was moderately or strongly implied causality. When we had action implications, those implied that causality had been inferred. Those action recommendations had stronger causal language than the linking sentences, and causal implications were often made through indirect means. Right? So not just, we only had 9 that just said X causes Y. Right? Okay, so this suggests that there are substantial disconnects in language and implications that we're dealing with here. Seems like there's some misalignment between linking language and action recommendations. So in our discussion, we talk a little bit about that we're in this situation where there's not a lot of clarity about what the authors were up to, what kind of methods they used. Maybe it's appropriate for some of them to be talking about causes and they aren't. Maybe some of them are helping themselves to causal type language and they ought not, right? So both of those seem definitely possible. There's some possibility that this sort of dance between, on the one hand, being taken as associational, on the other hand, being taken as causal, that dance has this nice effect of can work as this rhetorical shield against methodological critique. You can have people have the casual reader think, oh, maybe this is causal, maybe I should take it quite seriously, maybe I should do X, Y, and Z because of this article. And then if things get dicey methodologically, you can say like, oh, no, maybe we didn't quite mean anything quite so strong. I think it was Peter who likes to talk about Schrodinger's causal inference and contributed that component to the idea here. But the idea is something like, given that there are all these words used in not always terribly clear fashion, the unexamined work is both causal and not causal until we open the box of looking at the methods to see what was actually done, to see if we're comfortable using that causal language. We came to this strange conclusion that when you go back to this, that even the word associate doesn't necessarily just mean associate, it might be causal as well. So that's kind of an odd finding. People have kind of become alive to when people say associate, they might mean cause, such that maybe you're not safe anymore saying associate without people thinking that you mean cause. And all of these missing action implications, I assumed we'd find those everywhere. That most articles have them, but most articles don't. which leaves the work of what should we do about this knowledge that we've gained in scientific research, leaves it to the reader or the policymaker or the teacher or the lay reader to fill in those blanks, right? And maybe you think that's good. Maybe you think that goes outside the bounds of the role of the scientist. But the way it's done now is definitely that's left to the reader to fill that in, and maybe you think that's freeing, or maybe you think that's an inappropriate removal of responsibility from the scientist. Okay, so based on this, I think some folks have looked at this article and assumed that we would make like a pro-JAMA rule recommendation. So like, stop talking about causes, no more causal talk or something like that. And that's not our recommendation. Our recommendation is less language policing, less you can use cause if you do an RCT and not otherwise, and more sort of tell us about your methods, like show us your DAG, tell us why you chose the methods that you chose, tell us what your goal was in doing this work. So to be more honest and more clear about those items, so that we can sort of get that rich context that goes around these linking words and learn more from it. So we think that quantitative empirical research should clearly state its target estimate to clarify the research question, including explicitly stating when these estimates are causal. Okay, so because I think we have a few minutes, I do want to say something philosophical about this work. I have 3 reflections. So the first is that maybe this audience doesn't know, but maybe you do, I don't know, maybe you are very aware of this work in philosophy of science, but there's been a lot of work in philosophy of science that has been deflationary about what the literature calls the problem of wishful thinking. This is a quote from de Mille-Martin and Entman, who write that wishful thinking occurs when values are allowed to directly influence what methodologies or hypotheses are adopted, or how evidence is characterized. Now, I want to be clear, I don't think it's a problem that values are in science. I think it's unescapable. But when they're allowed to directly influence how the evidence is characterized, we get the problem with wishful thinking is something like the worry that scientists will only find what they want to find, right? So philosophy of science, because they're interested in talking openly about values in science, and they want to help scientists to think through how normative components show up in their work, they've sort of been deflationary about this possible problem of wishful thinking. I think these findings point to a possible case of wishful thinking that scientists want to be thought of as doing causal work, but they also don't want to get in methodological trouble in case they ought not have been doing causal work. So they have this sort of wish to find causes in our world to make it more understandable, to help us to intervene and improve our world. But it's not always the case that they can actually do that. So some of it seems to me to be this problem of wishful thinking. So I think philosophers should either show me why this case isn't a case of wishful thinking, or admit that wishful thinking is a real problem and like retake that up as a live issue. And if you're interested in this, I would recommend you read The Risk of Using Inductive Risk to Challenge the Value-Free Ideal, which is an article in Philosophy of Science that I think every scientist should read, honestly. Reflection 2. I think that one of the things that philosophers of medicine especially do is sort of look to categorize work and to count certain kinds of research either as medicine or as science or as something else based on the practical intent of the researchers, based on the intended use. And I'm noticing that, 65.8 of these studies didn't have any action recommendations. The scientists didn't tell us what they wanted people to go out and do with this research, right? We don't have access to that information. So if philosophers are going to insist, philosophers of science are going to insist that intent is one important way to categorize what counts as science or what counts as medicine, that seems kind of fraught, given that we don't have very good access to that information. So we can attempt categorization on other grounds. We can look for evidence of practical intent elsewhere. Or we can claim that, which I think we probably should do, that medical research needs to make explicit action recommendations. And if you're interested in this, you might be interested in philosophy of medicine broadly. I really recommend this book by Jacob Stiganga, Care and Cure, An Introduction to Philosophy of Medicine. If you're interested in thinking about why we count certain things as medicine, certain things as science, this is a great place to start. Really recommend it. And my third reflection is on authorship. So there's a literature in philosophy of science talking about scientific authorship. And often, possibly or partly because of differences in publishing between philosophy and science, philosophers of science points to the practice in science of conferring authorship on these large numbers of individuals as a boundary case for how authorship works. They looked at, like, I don't know, papers in like physics, hundreds of authors, many of whom I've never met, many of whom their contributions look quite different to what you might think of authorship in the philosophical sense. And point to that and say, like, they're pushing, these physicists, they're pushing out the boat on well, who counts as an author? And maybe we should change how we think about credit in science, given that, is anybody really the author of this paper anymore? So I think I want the experience of this paper means that I would like to leave open the possibility that co-authoring can really be co-authoring, even when it's 48 people. Like 48 of these people, they all did their reviews. They all looked at the draft. They all made substantial comments and changes to how it was done. We all argued about what counts as a weak kind of cause, right? So it's not impossible. I want to say to philosophers, it's not impossible that 48 people co-authored a paper. And I want to sort of push on what can sometimes be the cynicism in that literature for taking that kind of co-authorship seriously. So if you're interested in this kind of problem, I would suggest you look at Kukla's work. This one is a Philosophy of Science article from 2012, author TBD, Radical Collaboration in Contemporary Biomedical Research. So I think that's another area that's philosophically rich here. Thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Sarah. So because of the technical problems, we've been trying to work out what's the best way of doing the question and answers. Yeah, basically, anyone who's online who wants, we actually have a question and answer. Oh no, okay. Just use the chat box. Basically, if you have a question, just put it in the chat box. And Georgia Tomoba, who's here, will monitor that and relay it on to Sarah. Anyone in person who wants to ask a question, come to the front. Yeah, we'll stop showing, but then what will it show? That'll be interesting.
Us, I hope.
Is it?
Oh yes, yeah.
Oh yeah, okay. Is that Enigma? Or
all right,
no,
let's see.
Black. It's just a black screen.
For now. Oh, great.
Okay.
Let's see.
Yeah, so if anyone wants to ask a question in the room, come to the front and chat near the microphone so that everyone can hear it.
Okay. But I'm looking through the chat as well. Who's in the chat?
With no.
Okay.
We have one from the room.
Oh, I'm ready.
Do I go? Oh, come. Yes. Down the gauntlet.
Very, very exciting.
Through the enormous audience.
It's not a huge question.
Oh, yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
Really enjoyed the talk.
Thank you.
Really, really interesting. So I've got a few questions, but I just think for one.
I'm ready.
So I was just wondering how you felt about, obviously this is, you're looking at people explicitly stated in a journal. And I'm interested in what you think about what people are really thinking when they're doing this work. And obviously then it has to get put into journal speak. And I'm wondering how much of that is a distorting lens and whether it might actually underrepresent the kind of problems to identify.
Okay.
Might, but I'm interested to know what you think.
Sure. Yeah, thank you. I definitely am interested in the gap between the work that's done between co-authors when they're producing this kind of work, what goes through the mind of the scientists who are producing this work, and then what they feel they must do in order to publish. There's a variety of things I think to be dissatisfied with the current publishing system, and that's one of them, I think. So I'm hoping that the recommendations that we used, which were less focused on journals, please make this rule, and more focused on please authors tell us more of that internal process, like give us more methods, give us additional, like if you have to put in a supplement to make the journal happy, then fine, but like tell us more so that the reader has more to work with in terms of not just you said associate, so did 500 other people. Like, do you mean something different by that? Can we make any judgments about whether you had appropriate access to other kinds of words or just talk more causally? So that gap is definitely interesting, and I hope all the recommendations we made were made with that gap in mind. But in order for the scientists to be more comfortable to tell us more that isn't in journal speak, requires like trust of the reader, requires like an openness on their part. It requires like leaving themselves open to criticism in ways that are rough. So there's a certain kind of maybe naive openness that we're asking that more authors have, so that there's less of a gap between what you actually thought as you were putting together your work and the translation into journal speak that you felt you had to do. Whether or not that means that the problem is underrepresented, I'm not sure. I think we can't say too much because right now all we got is the journal speak. I think there could be interesting qualitative work to sort of, you give me your paper and then also I'm going to go sit in your lab for, well, I guess you have to do it the other way. First go sit in the lab for 6 months and then look at the paper and sort of look at the differences there. I think that would be illuminating. I think you'd also need to be quite vulnerable and strong in order to allow that work to happen. Am I in the right direction of your question?
No, that's great. I was actually thinking of experimentally.
Okay.
Authors of this paper actually probe them a bit more. Their intention.
That'd be great.
How that maps onto your.
That's the next project.
Yeah, for sure.
Sorry for people who couldn't hear. We were just saying it would be great to actually go back to the researchers behind the papers, find out what they actually meant. I know, thinking about it from the old days before I had my causal awakening, or whatever you might call it. You know, associate was your safe word. You could use it all the time and say, no, that's not causal. But what I found really interesting about what you've shown is that we've done that for so long that it's now kind of taken a causal secondary meaning, because we baked causality in there by deliberately avoiding causality.
People know that dance.
We have a question, so I'll read it out. So it's from Tom Yates. First of all, saying, in medical research, I wonder whether some of this ambiguity is because purely descriptive research seems sadly to be frowned upon. Yeah. Funders generally want hypotheses and impact where the data don't allow causal inference. I fear we get language creep because people have half an eye on the next grant application.
Yeah, Tom, thank you for that question. I think that's a plausible hypothesis for why we've got what we've got. I also think the way around that may have more to do with insisting on the usefulness of description. Like, as a philosopher of science, like, you look back through the history of science and a whole bunch of it is description, very valuable description of our world. That's clearly an important component of what science offers as a discipline. So when it started to become clear to me how devalued it was at this point, I was just sort of horrified because it's not sort of in line with what I had thought about what the goal of science was. So yes, it seems possible that what we're looking at here is related to a devaluing of descriptive research. I think that's unfortunate. I think the thing to do is to insist on the value of descriptive research if we can. Maybe that's a squishy request, but I'm sure somebody on this in this meeting is on those grant panels. I'm sure there's somebody who's a junior person now will grow up to make calls about this. So I think even though it's a squishy goal, we should continue to think that it's worth doing to insist on the importance of descriptive research.
Perhaps Georgia can put this in the chat. There was a fantastic paper published last year in the American Journal of Epidemiology by Catherine Lesko and Matt Fox and Jesse Edwards called A Framework for Descriptive Epidemiology. I know in the year before that, there was also one by Ellie Murray and Matt, again, talking about the importance of descriptive research. It really came up during the pandemic. I think there was a lot of highlighting the need for us to get better thinking about descriptive research. We have another question, which I'll read out for those in the room. Do you also see this as a guidance for reviewers? That's a very good question. Maybe this could be used as a reference to be given to the authors from the reviewers.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. Good to see you. So could this be used as a reference to give to authors from me? Certainly, I hope that anybody listening who does review work considers this, right? Who thinks about when they're looking at a new paper and they want to make changes, they want to talk to the authors about how they might improve it. One thing you could do is ask them for things that are in line with those recommendations we made at the end. Like, tell me more about your model. Tell me more about why you chose this rather than that way of speaking about the thing. So do I see this as guidance for reviewers? I mean, I'm not sure that's why we made it, but I'm hoping that people who read it are also reviewers and that it turns out to be useful in that way would be lovely. Let's see. Yes, we got one from Robert.
Yeah, it's I'm trying to see where it starts.
I guess more of a comment.
Yeah, I suspect that as Peter is suggesting.
Okay, so Robert is piggybacking on the suggestion that we follow up with authors and we look at that gap between what they'd like to say and what they feel like they have to say to get to the journal. And Robert is suggesting that possibly authors may not be able to provide an account of what they did, which is possible, right? But if that's the case, that surely raises a red flag that suggests that that suggests that maybe we need to go think about it some more. So yes, that is a sad possibility. I'm hoping that raising that or having that experience of someone asking you and the author being unable to give an answer can be useful for the next project.
I think, as Sarah knows, I'm a huge proponent of us abandoning euphemisms like association and just saying we seek to estimate the total cause effect of X and Y. You know, the estimated total causal effect of X and Y was this, confidence intervals. I've never had any problem with that until recently. The first time, should share it. It was a very sort of average journal, so perhaps a different audience to what I'm used to. And 2 of the 3 reviewers, that wasn't meant to sound as arrogant as it came across. So, not an epidemiology journal is what I mean. 2 of the 3 reviewers said he's used completely inappropriate causal language, whereas I was very explicit up front. We're seeking to estimate the causal effect. So that was very disappointing, but it will happen still. We have to get on JAMA's case, basically, and make sure, because they'll lead where they lead, the rest of medicine and health will follow, and make sure that their new guidelines are up to screen. We have some more questions. So we have been trying to teach this in our research and clinical learners. What recommends do you have on how to teach or model this for the next generation of researchers?
Thanks, Andrew. I mean, I'd love to see this paper read in a bunch of journal clubs. That'd be some start, right? Maybe that's too basic to even mention, but like that would be wonderful. It was hard for us all to do. That would be great if we get that kind of uptake. How do you model this? I think from like an individual PI level, this seems like a sort of taking the value of openness as really important, talking through the methods problems that you're having with your trainees, talking through with them why you've chosen the language that you've chosen, and trying to avoid that reason being because you want to do the association dance, right? So the basic answer, Andrew, is like, please read the article and pass it around. The more complicated is this sort of maybe being more explicit about what's important to you as a PI and modeling that for your trainees. And this kind of openness about the way we talk is going to be an important component of that.
Did anyone else in the room have another question or question they wanted to make? There's another one online. Yikes, it's just jumped away from us.
Could we make this? Could we make this into the journal submission process? Are you making it a causal claim? Yes, no. Tom, yes, thank you for that question, Tom. Do I like this? Okay, Ruth has replied. Do you think, did you set out to address the causal question? This may not result in a causal claim. Yes, I think I agree, Ruth, that I like that amendment better, but I'm also worried about sort of playing whack-a-mole at the journal level. I think the right place to place the responsibility here is going to be on the authors. Maybe that's a controversial thing to say. I think we have enough problems with publication systems generally that I don't know that I wanted to make it their responsibility to say yes or no, you made a causal claim. I'm worried that slips back into like, let's make more JAMA rules talk, and I don't love that as the answer. So maybe you could see that there's a worry that putting the responsibility on individual authors means people are going to get away with things, and that's possibly true, but I think that's where the responsibility lies, and we should leave it there, even though it's tempting to say, like, let's have the journals police this. So thanks, Tom.
We have another in-person question. Do you want to squeeze your way to the front?
Oh, yeah.
Through the hordes?
Yeah.
Sorry.
So I guess my question is, what is the misalignment? So like if the method's causal language isn't aligned with the action, how it affects implementation further down. So like do recommendations that are along the sort of diagonal become better at being implemented in like changes of practice or in terms of the guidance?
Yeah.
So like whether or not what we're doing doesn't reach the goal, and because of how we write about it, it's not being implemented in the same way.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Sorry, what was your name? Jeremy. Thank you. Yeah. So I think you could give an account that something like the intensified causal language is like in hope that lay people, policymakers will take this up, right? So if we talk about coffee causes Alzheimer's, then they'll have to do something, or for whatever example that you think is the case. So then it would be interesting to know whether or not this kind of intensive language results in more policy uptake. We don't know that answer from this work, but that would be interesting future work. I don't think it changes the normative outcome here, because even if we find that policymakers take up work that is done with stronger causal language, I still don't think we want to say then as scientists we should always be framing everything in causal language, even if that's not an appropriate given the methods and the kind of study we did. So that would be interesting, and I think it would make me sadder, would be my guess. But I think the thing I'm interested in as a philosopher, the normative force here remains, even if we found that policymakers love the causal language and take it up very seriously, we still might have a reason not to use it. Thank you.
Okay, I think we've come to the end of the hour. So you join me in thanking Sarah for a really fascinating presentation.
Thank you so much for your great questions. I enjoyed talking about it.
There is not another seminar scheduled in this current round of the Causal Inference Interest Group series, but we plan to be back in autumn with a new program, and hopefully many of you will be interested and able to join us there and then. Thanks very much to everyone,
yeah.
And especially Sarah.
Thank you.
I'm going to mute us here.
Okay.